Hello, my name is Kathleen Murphy-Hollies. I'm a PhD student at the University of Birmingham. I do work on what the prevalence of confabulation means for embodying and developing virtue. And this is me, first of all, trying to show that these two things are relevant to each other and will come together. So to give an outline of the talk, I'm going to start by talking about some key parts of virtue ethics which are relevant to me, particularly the role of reasons in virtuous behaviour. Then I'll talk about the basics of confabulation before moving on to 3 specific features of everyday confabulation, which I take from a paper by Emma Sullivan-Bissett. For each, I'll explain how I think they mean that it will intersect with virtuous behaviour. Finally, I briefly consider what the implications of all of this could be. Things look quite pessimistic for virtue at first, but ultimately I think that confabulation is not necessarily just a barrier to virtue formation and development. So starting with virtue ethics, from her book on virtue ethics, I've condensed down a description of virtue by Hursthouse as being a reliable disposition of character to act for certain reasons, with the right accompanying emotional response and an acute perception of scenarios which encompass that virtue in some way, so that agents recognise a need for virtuous behaviour and are competent in situ. So she describes these character traits as being not just tendencies, but being strongly entrenched and going all the way down. This means that the behaviour stems from a deep trait of character. We're not just by coincidence doing the right thing. We see and appreciate the values in some situation and we know how best to respond to them. So, for example, someone will be aware of and appreciative of a call to be compassionate and generous when they come across somebody in need, perhaps on the street in crisis. As the virtuous agent is naturally moved by those values, they're not distracted by other temptations and they're pleased to do what is virtuous. So they want to help that person and they don't have to force themselves. So in this way, their emotions could be said to be in tune with their actions. Aristotle sums up these many important facets of virtue in saying that true virtue is to be moved at the right times with reference to the right objects, towards the right people, with the right motive and in the right way. So I don't really want to pin down virtuous behaviour into a really succinct, it's either there or it's not there sort of definition, because I think I follow others like Julia Annis in saying that it's fundamentally developmental. So virtue is always in the process of being further honed and improved, and it's never done or finished. And this is one reason why I characterise confabulation as affecting virtue development and therefore affecting both young budding virtuous agents and more mature ones. So when it comes to the role of reasons in virtuous behaviour, Hursthouse includes a requirement to act for certain reasons, and Aristotle explicitly references a requirement to act for the right reason and with the right motive. So I suggest that ideally we would be able to identify and be conscious of our reason for action and our motives for 2 main reasons. Firstly, so that we can assess whether they are the right ones. This will inevitably get complicated, but it'll be something along the lines of your reason for action being responding to the need for help from someone, rather than trying to impress someone who you're out with at the time. The reason should reflect the values in question and regard them as a reason for your action. So I saw that someone needed help, so I helped them because that is a reason to help them. Secondly, knowing the reason that you're acting for plays an important role in developing that virtue for future adaptability. If you have very little insight into why you are doing what you're doing, perhaps responding almost robotically or by rote to situations calling for generous or patient behaviour, then this is not enough for virtue. If all you understand is that when I see a homeless person, I put money in their hand, then this behaviour is not stemming from any deeply entrenched trait. For this behaviour to be virtuous, despite it seeming to be the right thing to do on the surface. A deeper understanding of why that response is the right one, or what it is about that environment which calls for or is a reason for that response, is important. This more deliberative and nuanced understanding of your virtuous behaviour not only protects you from being a bit naive and making blunders, such as being over eager in your generosity, or alternatively being a bit exploited, but it also really importantly enables you to recognise better when that virtuous behaviour is called for in a wider range of highly variable and sometimes completely novel situations. So at first you might just do what's expected of you, but over time you come to truly value those reasons for their own sakes. Then you are independently motivated to be sensitive to them in the future. And instead of thinking, I should put money into the hands of homeless people, you understand that you should help people in all the various ways that people will need help, and your generosity is more likely to be successfully applied in the future, despite the vast array of different types of help and different types of people that you will come across. This is a really long process, perhaps a lifelong, But having a grasp of the reasons for virtuous behaviour is what makes it better than what Aristotle calls natural virtue, which is when even children have basic virtue when they do the nice thing, but it's naive, it's not developed, and it can be quite easily manipulated. So moving on now to confabulation. As you might expect, there isn't one clear universally accepted definition, so I'll give a little bit of background context. Confabulation is seen in both clinical and non-clinical or everyday contexts. Clinical confabulation is that which occurs alongside psychiatric disorders such as Alzheimer's or Korsakoff syndrome or anosognosia. But we also see everyday confabulation in the general populace. Some claim that everyday confabulation and clinical confabulation are completely different phenomena, but I'm more tempted to say that everyday confabulation is just less severe and there isn't a clinical cognitive deficit bringing it on. So I'm only interested in everyday confabulation when it comes to virtue. The most famous examples of everyday confabulation are of it happening in consumer choice and in justifying moral judgment. In this Nisbet and Wilson study, participants were asked to choose a pair of nylon stockings. Unbeknown to them, all of the stockings were identical, but they asked the participants why they have chosen the pair which they have, and they give reasons. They say things like theirs are the softest or the brightest, but obviously this can't be the case. It turns out that stockings on the right-hand side are actually consistently chosen, so their choice was often due to position effects. But the participants weren't aware of this influence, and they seemed to make up different reasons for their choice. In the study by height, participants read a story about a brother and sister who decide to sleep together. They're then asked whether they think that this was right or wrong, and as you would expect, most of them say that it's wrong. When they're asked why it's wrong, they say things about the danger of the sister getting pregnant with a child with abnormalities or it affecting their relationship. But the vignette that they were given was specifically set up so that those things don't apply. They use contraception and their relationship is not affected. So this is pointed out to them, and the reasons that they give are countered with these facts about the case. And so eventually a lot of them end up dumbfounded. Being dumbfounded means that you can't give an answer and you realise that you don't have an answer, and it can be quite unnerving and embarrassing and uncomfortable. So Haidt claimed that all of this reasoning was being done post hoc, created after the initial response of disgust and moral disapproval, rather than the reasoning driving that response to begin with. And in a similar way, reasons are created post hoc in everyday confabulation. So everyday confabulations are ill-grounded because they're not based on the available evidence, and so they misrepresent the world in some way. And they do not accurately capture what actually was efficacious in bringing you to take that action, make that choice, or form that attitude, and so on. In a stocking study, participants don't mention the position of the stockings as affecting their choice, and then they misrepresent the world in claiming that theirs are brighter or softer when this is not the case. But importantly, there's no intention to deceive. These people are not lying, they sincerely endorse their claims, and you cannot know when you are confabulating. So now I move on to some more specific features of everyday confabulation listed by Sullivan Bissett, and hopefully start drawing the two spheres together with each one. The first one I want to talk about with relation to virtuous behaviour is that they are provoked. So this is as opposed to spontaneous confabulations, which occur unprompted and are associated more with severe clinical confabulation in something like Alzheimer's. On the other hand, provoked confabulations are offered in response to a question posed to the individual. So it's not until participants are asked why they've chosen the stockings that they have, or why exactly they think it's wrong for the brother and sister to sleep together, that the confabulations come out. So I think that as our ethical behaviour is of very high concern to those around us, it's very likely and common that we will be asked to explain or justify our ethical behaviours, and so be provoked in this relevant way. On top of this, I suggest that when it comes to developing virtuous behaviour, this involves a lot of self-questioning. So in considering whether our behaviour is virtuous, we have to wonder whether we have been moved at the right times, towards the right people, with the right motive, and so on. So it's a lot to check and ask ourselves about. So I add to this feature that individuals can provoke themselves and their own confabulations. The observation that individuals do, in fact, confabulate even when alone or when no one is going to hear their explanation lends some support to this. So we can often be the ones to ask ourselves why we did something and want an explanation for ourselves rather than this always being somebody else. This kind of moral self-reflection and deliberation is required in ascertaining whether your current behaviour was appropriate and was virtuous, and to hone it further if needs be. So it's a key part of virtue ethics, but these self-provocations are vulnerable to being provocations for confabulation. So the next feature is that they are motivated. Sullivan-Bissett describes two key motivations involved in confabulation. The first is a motivation to give a substantial answer at all, and this is to avoid the embarrassment of dumbfounding. As I've mentioned, it's quite humiliating to find yourself unable to answer a question which you expect yourself to be able to answer. And in general, I think we expect others and ourselves to know why we do the things we do. So on top of this, with regards to our moral behaviour especially, the stakes are even higher to avoid dumbfounding. If we've done something contentious, a good explanation can really save us and our reputations, so we'll be extremely motivated to give an explanation at all. And this relates closely to the second motivation, which is for that explanation to protect positive self-representations. So these are concepts of ourselves which we hold. If we think of ourselves as generous or patient already, we're keen to provide an explanation which supports and emphasises that self-representation. I would say that the very concept of a virtue is perhaps one of the most explicit and highly regarded forms of a positive self-representation, and they are morally good representations. As we are explicitly considering whether our actions or attitudes reflect an ideal which we already accept as positive because they are virtues. This motivation is very likely to kick in and affect evaluations of our behaviour. It could bias them in terms of whether we really can count some action of ours as being appropriately virtuous and whether we were guided by the right reasons. So this might mean that in instances where our behaviour was actually lacking in some virtue, when we didn't actually do the generous thing, we confabulate reasons which are ill-grounded and do not accurately portray the circumstances in order to preserve that positive self-representation. So, for example, if I don't help that homeless person, I might say that, well, actually, it was a really busy street and I couldn't stop. But that's an ill-grounded statement. That's not the case at all. And it seems it would be better to know that really you were failing to recognise in that situation a call for generosity. So we should reflect on this and rectify it in order to develop virtue well, but these ongoing motivations mean that this process is vulnerable to triggering confabulation. Finally, I consider that the feature that everyday confabulations fill a gap. So more accurate explanations are not available to the agent. In cases of clinical confabulation, this could be due to brain deterioration. But in everyday confabulation also, we might not have insight into all of the cognitive systems which determine some of our behaviour. And I think that this happens with virtue. So ideally, virtuous behaviour stems from a robust and adaptable moral intuition. Aristotle emphasised that no set of rules would be extensive enough, and instead people will need a flexible faculty to guide them in situ, so that they feel and act in accordance with the merits of the case. So having a moral intuition like this is familiar to most of us, where we can experience a strong gut feeling that something is right or wrong. And ideally, given enough time and experience of various ethical scenarios, and time to reflect on the values within them, we develop gut feelings which reliably guide us towards the right thing to do and effectively realise the principles which we hold more explicitly. So, as is required for virtuous behaviour, your emotions here would be in tune with or in harmony with conscious deliberations and principles. Railton, in this paper in 2014, suggests that an evaluative perception, this type of intuition-based decision-making and behaviour, would be realised by the affective system, or what Kahneman would call System 1 processing. This is knee-jerk, quick, compelling processing, not slow and deliberative like System 2 processing, but there is mediation between the affective regions and higher, more conscious cognitions. So this could be the psychological underpinning to having these informed moral gut feelings, which have some interplay with higher order deliberations. But a key feature of the affective system, or System 1 processing, is that the causes of these feelings are opaque to introspection. So when we are pressed to explain why we have some gut feeling about something, we might eventually say, I don't know, but I just don't like it, and we continue to find that feeling compelling nonetheless. This is exactly what we see in Haidt's study. When participants have a gut feeling that the brother and sister sleeping together is wrong, they don't give it up, even when they can't give a good reason for it. But the causes of these feelings can be and often are important for virtuous behaviour. They can be bad causes. We can have implicit biases, which are giving us prejudiced feelings and stopping us from being more reliably kind to all groups of people. So in developing virtue, we need to consider what's in this gap to make sure that our intuitions reflect what we want them to. But in doing so, the gap can be filled with confabulation. So what is the upshot of all of this? So far, I've mostly just talked about the ways confabulation and processes involved in virtue development are likely to coincide, but is this good or bad? It certainly seems bad. It seems like it disrupts the process of virtue development negatively, and it stops us being able to better embody virtue over time because it hides from us when we fail to do so. However, something to remember here is that confabulation does not occur when the agent has access to better, more accurate explanations. Then she would use that, or she would be doing something more like lying than confabulating. What we have to compare the confabulating agent to is someone who is instead dumbfounded, and someone who accepts and is quite fine with being dumbfounded. So when you ask them why they didn't give money to the homeless, or even why they did, they just shrug their shoulders. And I think that this is more likely to be an end and a cut-off to further inquiry, and is overall a worse epistemological position for the agent to be in. If you're not motivated to have a stab at giving an explanation, then you're not going to be mulling over it, and you're missing out on an opportunity to give some more thought to whether you are behaving for the reasons that you think and that you would like. And you're not going to receive feedback from others, which is widely recognised as valuable input to developing virtue. So because confabulation stems from desire and motivations to have an understanding of yourself and of the situation, and although it is not accurate, it is a first stab, it is an opportunity to think more explicitly about your behaviour and your values and whether they align. So if we can be open-minded, confabulation can be, certainly won't always be, a starting point for further inquiry and starting to understand our own behaviour better. So this is a summary of my talk. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to seeing any feedback.